Only 70 towns in England have kept their old, medieval city walls. Berwick-upon-Tweed, for example, features the best preserved post-medieval town defences in the country, and Chester has kept the full circuit of their walls, and Canterbury has about half.
But the longest and the most famous remaining town walls are here in York. Today they span 2.1 miles, 3.5 kilometres. They have 4 main entrances called bars and 6 smaller entrances called posterns, and 2 smaller modern gateways.
These days, they are a lovely staple of the city and an interesting and interactive tourist attraction. One can walk the periphery of inner York, being only interrupted 6 times, with the largest of that being between Monk's Bar and Warmgate Bar.
The walls of York today are a landmark, a tourist attraction, a way to skip the Christmas markets, or an interesting walk to work. But originally, they had a very different purpose.
Construction of them began during the Roman rule of York, then named Iberacum. The Romans constructed a fort in York around 70 AD to act as a pressure point in the growing network of garrison forts to hold Britain against Celts on the fringes of the island that evaded Roman rule. Other settlements, for example, Chester in the Welsh Marches and Caerleon in Wales, served a uniform purpose.
The fort was put beside the River Ouse, and, in typical Roman fashion, it was square. Over modern York, the fort extended through the Museum Gardens, Monk Bar, and the Merchant Taylor's Hall.
The York Minster Cathedral, which you can see behind me there, was actually built on top of the original Roman fort, and you can actually see some of its remains down in the cathedral's basement.
The most prominent part of the Roman walls remaining is the multangular tower, which now sits in the Museum Gardens. It was built under the reign of Emperor Septimus Severus, who expanded and upgraded the walls whilst he resided in York between 209 and 211 AD. However, around about 400 and 411 AD, the Romans left York and began to leave wider Britain, as the western half of the empire reeled from economic strife and problems of a certain Germanic nature.
As was characteristic of a Western Roman decline, general chaos and ruralisation occurred, as there was an exodus from urban areas. York became a scruffy ghost town. Its walls fell into disrepair and grass grew high across the streets. The time of the Old English's control of York is fairly murky, but the city remained a set of Roman ruins well into the 7th century, when England's Christianisation began.
King Edwin of Bernicia and Deria, which later merged to form Northumbria, was baptised here in York. Not on this very spot, and certainly not with this church. It was a wooden church, made of wood, hastily made for the occasion. He later helped maintain York's city walls. Not these walls, different walls.
Edwin later ordered a stone church dedicated to St. Peter to be erected in the same spot he was baptised. Later on, the Danish Great Heathen Army took control of the city in 867 AD. They restored the walls and left a tower built by the English on the old wall intact, which was probably built during Edwin's reign.
Now this tower, the Anglian Tower, is phenomenal, as it's the only surviving structure of its kind in the entire country. And it's one of 2 surviving secular Anglo-Saxon structures. It is believed to have been built by King Edwin and was fully rediscovered in 1971 after its initial uncovering in 1839.
The maintenance of the wall was ramped up between 1070 and 1100 under the reigns of William the Conqueror and William II. But most of the wall that you see here today was built between the 12th and the 14th century.
Micklegate Bar, for example, was the traditional entry point to York for monarchs. In a ceremony dating back to King Richard II, they would touch the state sword as they entered the city.
It started as a simple gatehouse that was constructed here in the 12th century. Eventually, however, more complex defences, such as a portcullis and a barbican, were added in the 14th century. Micklegate Bar is also the place where the heads of defeated rebels and enemies of the crown were displayed to deter trouble.
Bootham Bar has some of the oldest remaining sections of the wall, mostly built in the 11th century. However, much of what you see here today was built in the 14th century and the Victorian era. Woolgate Bar, built in the 12th century, is one of the early additions of the York City walls. The Barbican was built in the 14th century. From 1376 up until 1957, this could be rented as a dwelling. You could live here. And is one of the only places in York to retain its inner gateway, its portcullis, and its barbican.
Like Micklegate, Wormgate was also used to display severed heads, and it is the most elaborate of the city gates, built to be a self-contained fortress, which the fortress part dates back to around the 14th century. By the Victorian period, the walls were in a state not dissimilar to when the Romans left the city. However, public support and local campaign groups sought to save the walls from proposed demolition. This is when the 2.5-mile walking route was established, and the Victorian Bar was built in 1838, and the Robin Hood Tower in 1889.
The walls were also widened to be safer to walk on, and the upper stonework that was in decay and disrepair was repaired, refurbished, and rebuilt.
The Victorian period also saw the beginning of excavations. These began in 1831, around the Roman-built Multangular Tower. 8 years later, in 1839, the previously mentioned Anglian Tower was discovered among the earthworks.
Work paused in 1841, but picked up again in 1926 under S.N. Miller, with the aim of fully excavating the entire tower.
Between 2001 and 2004, digs took place around the tower. 6 excavation trenches were dug, uncovering Roman fortresses, evidence that the stone tower and foundations were built earlier than previously thought. And that St. Leonard's Place is used as a hospital, and evidence of numerous earlier antiquarian excavations.
The walls of York, therefore, have defined the lives of the people who have lived and worked within them, who in turn have defined the walls as they are today.
From the Romans to the 21st century, they have been a hub of interest and importance, and will likely continue to be so well into the future.